All right, thank you very much. I'm going to do this seated. Yeah, like Chris said, for years I was focused on planning issues, zoning, and I've seen a lot of success. I see in Toronto you got some great things coming up, but once you allow more apartment buildings, especially on small lots, you start running into some pretty serious building code issues. They're pretty similar in the United States and Canada, so that's why I named the organization Center for Building in North America. I wanted my focus to be on comparative research, comparing to the world in general, but for just logistical purposes, Western Europe is the focus, the comparator generally. And so today I want to talk about elevators. Elevators are a pretty small part of a building. They're roughly 2% of the total cost of construction. The issues here are not going to drive cost in a really big way across the whole building, but I think it's a good lens to look at building code issues in general, the things that, the themes about over-dimensioning, about technical codes and standards and some labor issues. You're going to find them, in every part of the building, from, sprinklers to heat pumps to stairs to garbage, as mentioned earlier today. With that, whoops. How do I go to the next one? Big button? Big button. There we go. Okay. So elevators in North America are extremely expensive compared to elevators in Western Europe and elsewhere throughout the world. So here I've got some examples. I got one in Belgium, one in France, one in Pennsylvania, one in New Jersey. I don't have any Canadian examples on this slide. Maybe someone can send me some later. But I believe the Canadian elevators are roughly the same cost as the ones in the US, but in Canadian dollars instead of US. So maybe slightly cheaper, but way closer to the US examples. So as you can see, in Europe, for a 5 or 6 stop installation, you're going to be looking at maybe 30,000 euros. Once you apply, VAT and then do a purchasing power conversion to account for the fact that salaries in Europe are lower, you'll get the elevators are about $50,000, $60,000 each. In the United States, they're well over 150, between 150 and $200,000. And the consequence is that North America has very few elevators. This might be hard to see, but United States is at the bottom. These are elevators per 1,000 residents. So the United States has about 3 elevators. Canada, as in most things, is a little better than the US, but not that much better, 4 elevators. And then Western Europe, much higher. The highest in the world is Greece, a lot of post-war development in small point access block buildings with a single stair, maybe 4, 5, 6 units per building, and they each have an elevator. That's got over 40 units per 1,000 residents, but even countries like Germany or France with older building stocks still have at least twice as many elevators as the United States and Canada per capita. And this affects building design. So in the United States and Canada, we tend to build what are known as double-loaded corridor buildings. You have a long corridor in the middle, and then on either side, you've got units. This one's all studios. It tends to bias you towards studios and one-bedroom apartments. This is driven by a number of things. It's driven by the zoning envelope. I saw, you guys are going to be allowing 25-foot deep buildings on the major streets. That's going to be way too deep for what's called a point access block building, usually built with a single stair. I know last year at this conference, Conrad Speckert presented on the fact that in the United States and Canada, we tend to not allow pretty much any buildings with only a single stair. So this elevator issue kind of builds on that. So if you're going to have 2 stairs, the building is going to be larger. You're going to have a corridor cutting through the middle. You're probably only going to have fewer elevators servicing the same size building, just because you have so many units off of a corridor and so many units in a building. The typical way to design in not just Western Europe, but really the entire rest of the world, whether it's those high rises in mainland China or buildings in Latin America, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, is what are called these point access blocks. They typically have 1 stair per sort of core. And then there's usually 1 elevator per core. So this building and the last one, can I go back? Yeah. These are the same. I don't remember what the floor area is, but they have the same number of square meters per floor. It's just that you can see the zoning envelope is a little bigger. The North American one is a lot deeper. The European one is a lot thinner, but wider. And you can see even though each segment only has one stair, there's 3 stairs in the building instead of 2, and there's 3 elevators in the building instead of 1. And this allows for it's much easier to build family-sized units without the windowless or shared light bedrooms. And it requires some different zoning approaches. You probably want to zone more land for multifamily and have the the FSIs, or the general amount of floor area per building or per lot, be a little lower, but sort of greater extent of multifamily development. But it also requires more elevators. And as we described earlier, elevators are extremely expensive. So this is not going to be affordable in a North American context for a mid-rise building. In the United States, you'll have no elevator at all. We have very loose rules about accessibility and when elevators are required. Technically, in American building codes, you actually don't need any elevator at any height as long as the ground floor is accessible. I believe in Canada you guys are stricter about this. The provincial building codes are stricter. However, you are more likely to see walk-up buildings. So in your multiplex zoning, I don't remember exactly how tall those are, probably 3 stories, 4 stories. A 3 or 4 story building in Western Europe will always have an elevator. Increasingly, buildings in Eastern Europe will have elevators as well. My mother lives in a 5-story building in Bucharest in Romania. It has an elevator. I live in a 5-story building in Brooklyn. It does not have an elevator, despite the fact that obviously Brooklyn is a little wealthier than Romania. The high cost of elevators also affects retrofits. In Western Europe, there is a big push to retrofit elevators into older buildings, especially in Spain and Italy. In mainland China, there's also quite a big push. They have a lot of 7-story walk-up buildings built in the, 80s, 70s. So they're installing a lot of elevators in them. There's sort of creative ways you can do it. I don't think this is as big of an issue in Canada. I think a lot of more of your development is post-war and had elevators, but in the United States, this is an issue. In New York City, where I live, a lot of old tenements that I don't think anyone would ever even imagine could possibly have an elevator, but in fact, they could if the elevators were cheaper. So I want to talk about the cost drivers for elevators. So as I mentioned in the beginning, there's really 3. There's overdimensioning, there's technical codes and standards, and there's labor. So let's talk about first the overdimensioning of elevators. Something you'll notice if you go in an elevator in Western Europe or East Asia is they're much, much smaller. In Western Europe, the typical elevator is 1.1 meters wide by 1.4 meters deep. This is large enough for a person in a wheelchair and someone behind them to stand. The wheelchair will not be able to do sort of a full turn, approaching the elevator and then in the elevator, but it is big enough for a wheelchair, for actually a quite large-sized wheelchair. The doors are typically about 0.9 meters wide, which is big enough for even the largest power chairs. Whereas in the United States and in Canada, we require, I misspelled stretcher. We require not only a turning radius for the wheelchair, so at least if the elevator is empty, if there's people in the elevator, you probably can't execute the full turn. But if the elevator is empty, at least you can turn with a wheelchair. So that requires a very wide elevator. But we also are very strict about fitting a stretcher. The European and the Asian elevators will fit stretchers, but you have to prop them up, you have to sort of put them in a seated position, which can be a problem if you have certain skeletal muscular injuries, if you're trying to perform, I don't remember what it's called, the sort of continuous chest compressions on somebody. I have never seen any evidence that we have better outcomes for example, out-of-hospital cardiac arrests, which is sort of the major reason why you'd want a stretcher in the elevator. In fact, Europe tends to have better outcomes, at least in the United States. I couldn't find anything about Canada. So I have never seen any hard evidence that requiring the stretcher, results in better health outcomes, but it definitely does drive a lot of cost. So elevators, for a new elevator in a new building, a new mid-rise building, let's say, in Canada, the typical elevator will be 1,588 kilograms or 3,500 pounds. Whereas in Europe, it'll be 630 kilograms. The actual size of the cabin, it's about twice as large in North America as in Europe. When I talked about those costs in the beginning, those are just the dollar costs of actually installing the elevator. That doesn't include the shaft, which, if it's double the size, it's probably going to be double the cost, or, your foregone floor area. The way that things are planned in North America, typically the circulation of the stairs and the elevator will cut into your saleable floor area. So there's cost beyond that. So this is the over-dimensioning aspect. There are huge labor issues, particularly in the United States. I was not able to get that detailed about the Canadian context. This is the same labor union, the International Union of Elevator Constructors, so I would guess that the issues are similar, but I can't promise you that these are similar issues. So this is in their labor agreement with the manufacturers, that's Kone, Schindler, Otis, and ThyssenKrupp are the 4 large ones, actually both in Europe and North America. They are very particular about what work has to be done in the shaft versus what work can be done in a factory. So, there's a lot of desire in architecture and development to do, prefabrication of parts. The most aggressive forms of this are this sort of modular 3-dimensional stuff where you build a whole room and then, ship it and just sort of place it with a crane onto the building. There's also sort of panelization, but on a far more basic level, when you deliver your sort of electronic components to the building or mechanical components like an elevator, you want them to be as put together as possible. Because of very unique agreements, at least with the United States locals of the IUEC, they're even like down to drilling holes has to be done in the elevator shaft, which is very expensive. It's you don't get the same precision. And it can also sometimes introduce safety issues. The longer time you're spending in the shaft, the more likely you are to, something bad happen. So this is just an example of an agreement between, I think this was Schindler, over a modernization model. Elevators have to be essentially replaced every 30-ish years. So, when an elevator needs to be modernized, this is some sort of support structure that sits at the top of the shaft. And they argue over which holes can be drilled in the factory, which holes can be drilled on site. And then in some cases, the hole really has to be drilled more precisely than it can on site. But the contract has traditionally specified that this should be done on site and not in a factory. So they'll compromise and they'll drill a small, what's called a pilot hole in the factory, and then a larger hole on site. So you're drilling the same hole twice, which obviously drives up the cost. And then the third cost driver, this in some ways was the most interesting to me, are these, there's the building code, right? In the United States, we call it the International Building Code. There's the National Building Code of Canada, which is then, sort of modified and adopted by the provinces. But then there's also this whole web of referenced standards. The building has become so complicated that you can't fit all of the rules into the main building code. So, we reference these standards. There's an electrical code, there's a plumbing code, there's an elevator code. And the elevator code in the United States and Canada is separate from the elevator code in almost the entire rest of the world. So the European Union did a great job of harmonizing codes within their member states in order to encourage commerce, sales, efficiency, and the whole rest of the world, Africa, East Asia, Oceania, South Asia, Latin America, all decided, Europe traditionally had the most elevators of any continent. Now China has way more, but traditionally it was Europe. Most of the major manufacturers are based in Europe. Why don't we just adopt the European codes? And this allows parts to be traded, internationally. The same part can be sold in South Africa, Malaysia, and Germany. The United States and Canada about 20 years ago harmonized the codes with each other. So now we share the same elevator code, but we are almost unique in the world in having these separate codes. Japan also has its own code. I don't know anything about that. So what this means is when a part needs to be purchased, you're selling a $50 some little part, $50 part. It costs a lot of money to certify it to a standard, and if you certify it to the European norm, which has now become the global norm through the ISO, you will be paying, let's say, $500,000 to certify it, or you can pay $500,000 to certify it for the U.S. and Canadian market. If you're certifying it for the U.S. and Canadian market, you get access to a market that has 1.1 million elevators. If you certify it for the global market, you get access to a market that has, 10 million elevators or more. So there's also significant variation even within North America. There's one sort of model elevator code called the ASME A17.1/CSA B44 code, but it's worse in the United States, as always. but each province in Canada adopts like sort of a different version of it. They can sometimes modify theirs a little bit. In Canada, you guys are a little bit better than the United States about not making little annoying modifications to it. But there's about 100 different jurisdictions in North America, and they each sort of have their own slight differences on it. This map is probably not up to date. It's not really possible to keep track of it unless you're the elevator industry. So the real world impact of these different codes and standards. On the left, this is a company called Witter, which makes doors. They're based in Germany, I think. Among other things, they make elevator landing doors. So if you go to the website and you click what region you're in, there's a North America region, a Europe, other regions. The one on the left is, I think that's Europe, but it happens to look the same for everywhere outside of North America. This is the number of parts. You can't really see it, but there's, I don't know, 24 different elevator doors. And then you click on the North America version and you get, I don't know, 7 or something like that. So you have a much smaller market for parts. This reduces competition. You have smaller, mid-sized companies that don't enter the market because the certification barriers are so high. And I still have some outstanding research questions about Canada, given that the United States is just a much larger market. I was able to go much more in depth. I'm just going to get to the first one. If anyone has any elevator proposals for 4 to 6 stop elevators, I would love to see them. I won't share it. We can talk about the terms of it, but I would like to include a Canadian example here because I don't want the Canadian regulators to believe this is a U.S. problem because it's definitely a Canadian one as well. And then I'll get to the last one. The question I have is, when you're dealing with these multiplex, these new multiplex zoning districts in Toronto and Vancouver, when you're building a 3 or 4 story building, are these going to get elevators? Probably not. They're not going to be accessible to people with disabilities. They're not going to be accessible to a family with a stroller. As the population ages, it's going to cause issues. I got some recommended reforms, but you can look at them over time. But thank you very much. I just want to emphasize, this is, the elevator is 2% of the building, but you will find these same issues in every single part of the building. And in the future, I'm hoping to get to other ones. But I think this is an interesting field, an interesting place for the YIMBY movement to go. Because once you've reformed the zoning codes, you still have this whole sort of web of building codes and reference standards that I think are important and deserve more attention. Thank you very much.